pianos and synthesizers are occupying this role that traditionally the rhythm guitar has. Something that we've been doing for quite some time now. You know, the sound has some bits of fusion elements and some bits of, I guess, the djent style that all of us quite like a lot, this kind of modern progressive style that's very syncopated and heavy. But achieving that without the guitars is an interesting thing, because the guitar sound is usually what gives the djent sound, you know? So trying to do that through other means frees you up to explore a lot of cinematic rounds, a lot of synthesizer stuff that a lot of progressive bands don't really get to do. So basically it's opening up. By removing one element from the typical toolbox, we open things up to really explore other sonic elements that many bands may not get to explore.
Did it happen by accident that you just, maybe you were looking for guitars and you never were able to get one and you ended up just kind of sticking to the trio, or was it deliberate?
It was deliberate, but we the three of us did have a band together with a guitar player many years ago. It was a band called Gravity in the Cleveland area, and we split with that guitar player in 2013, and he's now gone to LA and plays with a lot of pop artists. Most notably, he's Adam Lambert's guitar player now. So he's made fairly well for himself in his own way. But our idea was to see what we could do without a guitar player, and originally things were a lot more like a traditional jazz trio, in which context it's very normal to not have a guitar player. So right. Thinking about things like whether it's, you know, Bill Evans trio or any sort of traditional jazz trio that's driven by piano. Mm-hmm. But since all of us love metal music, it was somewhat inevitable that things would get a bit heavier. And so we just had this thought experiment of why not make things heavier and make the music that we really want to make, but don't use a guitar, and just see what happens. How are we going to be forced to handle that lack of mid-range content? Because usually the guitars fill up so much space in the mid-range. And so without that, what are we going to do to make things not empty? And so part of the solution was analog synthesizers, a lot of very distorted analog synthesizers. And part of it also was bass guitar. So the bass guitar is very upfront and forward in the mix as well, which is kind of, it's not just the emancipation of the keyboards, it's also the emancipation of the bass guitar, which is often also buried in a lot of metal music. Yeah. And we've just been running with it ever since. I think if there ever was a need to have a guitar player, we wouldn't be opposed to it, because I don't believe in rules. I don't believe in setting, you know, artificial constraints, but so far the music hasn't really called for it.
Are you a schooled keyboardist, or?
I am both in classical and jazz. I studied classical piano for many years, and then I went to Oberlin Conservatory, where I studied composition for film and jazz piano. So, you know, it's very much part of my schooling, but to be honest, as the years go by, I find that, you know, jazz vocabulary is not quite as much a part of what I do, and that's just because that's the way the songs have evolved. You know, it's just the way it is. But I do have a deep love for a lot of jazz musicians, and both, you know, in the bebop and modal spheres, but also, you know, sometimes a bit in the fusion world as well.
What are your influences as far as some of the classic stuff from the 70s or 60s compared to something that's going on right now? Like, for example, I'm sure you like Snarky Puppy or something like that.
McCoy Tyner grabbed me very quickly. There is a certain way that he does chord voicings that is extremely, you know, it evoked something emotionally in me. And for me, all the music I love, I have to have a very strong emotional attachment to it. I mean, I respect intellectual and cerebral music a lot, and I suppose you could say I make intellectual and cerebral music, but for me, the emotional impact has to come first and foremost. I really felt that in McCoy Tyner's playing, especially with the Coltrane Quartet, which is, you know, John Coltrane is one of my idols as well, and I think the main reason I get so inspired by Coltrane is because of that spiritual and emotional force that propels his playing. And even when he's throwing out the so-called sheets of sound, which is very technical playing, there is something extremely expressive and emotional about it. Jan Hammer's playing, which is a little bit more in the fusion world, but I think that comes through a lot in my solo playing as well as, doing synth solos, especially the way that he bends. I always loved his bending because it was very guitar-like to me.
Yeah.
And I tend to typically be inspired more by guitar players than keyboard players, just because I like the sound of the way guitar players play, the way they phrase. I find it just very expressive. And I also love the way that saxophone players play. I think part of that might be the fact that they, by necessity, have to take breaths. So there's a cadence to their playing that's very almost vocal, because you have to take those breaths before you make each new sentence. And I find that some more keyboard-oriented keyboard players don't really do that with their playing, and so it feels a little bit unnatural to me.
It's funny, I've never thought of that until you just mentioned it now. The fact that they have to measure what they're playing by their breath. It's interesting. That's great. I didn't notice an absence of guitar as a negative thing when I first heard your music. And there was one other band recently. Oh yeah, it's Oddleaf. They're another prog band that's in France. They don't really have a main guitar player in the band. And another prog fan said, "Oh, I missed the guitar." But I was thinking to myself, I didn't feel any missing, like anything was missing in your music as well. It didn't feel like anything was missing.
Really, it doesn't have to be a negative, because there are so many things that would ordinarily be covered up by the presence of a guitar. And one thing that we love to do is cinematic and orchestral elements. And I do a lot of orchestrating, in my day job. I do composing for video games. So I'm very used to working with orchestral music, but very often in the context of a metal band, the orchestra has to be dumbed down to its very simplest elements. A loud horn here, a string melody here, and that's really all you can hear over the guitars. But when you lose the guitars, you're allowed to indulge in so many orchestral intricacies as well, which is really cool. And it's just one example of the ways that you can be more subtle and a little bit more, deliberately experimental with sound design in more interesting ways.
When you do your composition work, is it, are you hired specifically and they say, we want you to create such and such music for this game and all that, so you're kind of constrained right away by what they want, or are you given a lot of freedom?
I mean, the job is normally like any other composition for media, where directors have visions and you execute the vision. So right now actually this week I'm working on the score for Jurassic Park Survival, which is in the Jurassic Park universe, it's the direct follow-up to the first film. So it's NBC Universal's new kind of Jurassic Park offering, not Jurassic World, which they've been doing for quite some time, but it's returning back to the Jurassic Park thing.
I see.
And so in the context of that, it's John Williams. He set the sonic universe for what Jurassic Park has to sound like. He's old, so I'm here, and that's basically how it goes. But not all games are that specific. Sometimes you have a little bit more freedom. And I just finished work on a game called Painkiller, which is coming out in the fall, which has a very, very actually progressive metal score. A lot of detuned 7-string guitars, a lot of polyrhythms, a lot of really quite crazy stuff. So
Oh, that's interesting.
depends on the job.
Yeah, my kids play a lot of video games. They get a lot of their musical nourishment, I guess you could call it, from games. So I appreciate that there's real artists who are doing the game's music. They're not just churning out crap or something, and they're taking it serious. Yeah.
There was I think a bit of a stigma against game music for quite some time, that it was kind of the bastard child of media composition, where if you were really good, you did film music, and if you were a little bit less good, you did TV music, and if you really didn't have what it takes, you did game music. That was kind of the way people thought about it for some time, but I think that's always been false, and it's false more now than ever before, because the music in a lot of games now is just absolutely sublime, and very often game music allows you to experiment a lot more than film and TV, because film and TV, first of all, the average film may be an hour and a half. When we finished the score for Space Marine 2, which was a game that came out, I guess, last year, it was over 3 hours of music. So there's a lot more content, And within that, there's a lot more chances to experiment and do twists on things and tell stories in radical ways. So I think in many ways, game music is a very, very exciting kind of frontier for composing and also for sound design.
Well, back to your band then. So you got a new album coming out. It's the second album. It's called Cinder. Did you have anyone singing on your first album, or is this a new experiment?
The first album, on the last track, we had the singer Anneke van Heersbergen, the Dutch singer who's quite prolific in the progressive world with Devin Townsend and Arjen Lucassen and, a million other things.
Sure, yeah.
As well as her other great bands of her own. She sang on one song at the close of the album, but that was a bit different because it was basically a piano piece, a piano and orchestral piece that she sang on.
Okay.
So it was on the album, but it was not really a band offering. And I felt a little bit guilty that I robbed my bandmates the chance to appear, on a song with her.
Right.
So,
right. Yeah.
So this time around, it was kind of an interesting challenge. Not necessarily a challenge to write music with a singer, because in my other bands I do that all the time. So that's not specifically the challenge. The challenge is to make it cohesive with an instrumental record, so that I think it's track 5. And then when you get to track 6, 7, and 8, I don't want the listener to suddenly feel like something's missing, because you had that, you were given the missing ingredient, and then everything else sounds pedestrian in comparison. So to write an instrumental record with a vocal song can be a very interesting challenge that requires a different type of vocal writing than maybe I would do for a different project.
How do you balance between the technicality and the emotion?
I think it has to be instinct for me, and I have a very I've talked about this before, but I have a very spiritual approach to songwriting, and this is just my personal belief, the way I write. I believe that songs have souls, and they kind of exist on some metaphysical realm maybe that is distinct from us. And so when I write songs, I feel like I'm interacting with the song as an entity. And as I write, it's almost like we have a dialogue. And I find that the most important thing you can do as a songwriter is listen to your song in the dialogue and find out what the song is really asking. What does the song feel like it needs to achieve fruition? And by the same token, what does it not need? And don't be selfish in your own ego, and instead think about serving the song and how the song feels that it needs to be fulfilled. I always approach songwriting that way, and what that means is that if a song is a very emotional song that feels like it needs no technicality really to speak of, fine. We won't do that. The opening track on the album, it's a 3-part song called Jupiter, and it's a 13-minute song, and it has no solos. And that's a bit strange for a progressive song, especially a long progressive song, where the average lengthy progressive track will have some solo of some sort. But it's a very emotional piece, and I just didn't feel like it was asking for a solo. So we never did it. By the same token, you have a piece like The Devil's Eyes, which is kind of the most dark and intense track on the album, and it's kind of a love letter to classic horror films.
Cool.
And it, when I was writing that song, it was just screaming for very, very technical playing. And it doesn't really have a solo per se, but it has a ton of odd meters and 16th note runs and flourishes and all this crazy stuff, because that's just where the song wanted to go. And I always tend, with Lux Terminus, to write linear from left to right. I tend to not really write a chorus and then a verse and then this and then kind of, piece it together. I like to write as if it's one, paragraph, left to right. And so I tend to think, what came before? Where does the song want to go in its linear progression? And I just follow that. And so very much, the mood of the song and the mood that I'm in when I'm writing will kind of influence where that narrative structure will go. And I think intuitively there ends up being some element of balance between the more emotional writing and the more technical writing. But I try to never think of it that way. I just write left to right and see what happens. And I think it's going to ultimately be up to subjective, taste, how that balance is resolved, because I suspect for some listeners who really love extremely technical progressive music, they may listen to our music and think, I really could use, more solos or more technical playing, because I think there's only like maybe 3 proper solos on the record, 3 or 4 solos. But then other listeners may hear it and say, actually, this balance is perfect, and it really, contributes something different, which is an emotional edge that a lot of progressive music doesn't have. So,
Right.
your mileage may vary, I suppose.
So you're saying then that your music is more song oriented and less as just a platform for a musician XYZ to show off his chops.
I don't care about that at all. I really don't. I mean, me personally, excuse me, I find solos extremely uninteresting. And I don't say that to disparage other artists who do a lot of solos. It's just for my own writing, I would much rather have an interesting melody or something sonically that's interesting, or some kind of, overall compositional thing, rather than a solo section.
Yeah.
Which is just an excuse to flaunt. Now, if the solo section provides something, of substance, like for instance on the single Mosaic Mind, there's a solo that's basically intended to be a way to reach from point A to B, and it's kind of a conduit between a very, heavy and crazy section and a very uplifting section that is the close of the song. And I wanted some kind of conduit to take you from point A to point B, and the solo was the way to achieve that. So there was something, linear narrative speaking that the solo provided. But generally speaking, to have a solo to have a solo is not something that interests me.
A lot of artists who have great songs, they say it just kind of came from somewhere. It was like you say, it has a soul. I hadn't heard it in such a distinct way, but a song has a kind of identity already. So your task is really to work with it, but there is some interpretation, right? I mean, some ideas just come like that, all done and finished. Others you really have to kind of mold or something, would you say?
Yeah, of course. And if you view songs as being metaphysical entities distinct from us, then if it came to me versus coming to the guy the next room over, the song that emerges is probably going to be radically different depending on who's doing the interpreting and who's having that conversation with the song. And that's something I really experience working with different bands, because Lux Terminus is a huge part of my musical life, but it's not the only part of my musical life. And then when I work with other bands, I find that the lens of interpretation takes it in very different directions. Songwriting for me is an iterative process. It very rarely just happens immediately. Song kernels happen immediately, and I trust my instinct usually. I mean, if I have a first instinct of something, I try to trust it because I feel like it came from somewhere for a purpose. But the process of going from that to the finished song sometimes can be an extremely exhaustive process. And this album in particular took a long time. I mean, I think we were working on it almost 5 years to go from start to finish. And a big part of that is really paying attention to that process and working on a song, getting it to a particular point and thinking, okay, it's at a decent stopping point here, but something's telling me this song is not finished. It's not telling me I'm satisfied, so there's more happening. But right now, maybe I'm too busy, or the other guys are busy, in their daily lives. So we're going to come back to this later and see what happens. And then you revisit it maybe 2 months later and see what happens. And so, that process can be quite exhaustive. And I think there were probably some songwriters who would have stopped well before I did. But I have maybe sadistically high standards for myself. And I'm petrified of being boring. So it's like, I don't want I don't want there to be even like, 10 seconds of music that people are thinking, this is just a drag. I'm going to turn it off.
Right.
So
Right.
it's
Cool.
quite an exhaustive process for me. And maybe a lot of your audience may know me as the keyboard player at Pain of Salvation. So I've been touring
Hmm.
with them for 3 years now. And that's a different mindset entirely to making music. And recently, as of this year, I've started playing with the Dutch symphonic metal band Within Temptation, and that's a completely different thing as well. So I think because I do so many different things, it means that different parts of my soul are tickled in different ways.
Hmm.
And Lux Terminus happens to receive this extremely, it's the most creative endeavor that I have, and it's the most personally fulfilling thing that I do,
Hmm.
where it feels like it's the most direct link to who I am, emotionally and spiritually, and the most self-expressive thing. It's an open playground. So if we write a song that does require something very technical, I'll do it because we don't really have those rules. We're not working with a label that's mandating a particular commercial vision, and because I do so many other things, I'm also not dependent on making millions from this. So, I can just kind of do, do what I do and be, very true to what I want to do artistically. And I think it makes it very different from how it might be if this was, my primary financial vehicle, first of all, that, I'd be beholden to certain other, business interests to make things make sense financially. Kind of divorcing this project from that aspect of my life has meant that it's a very artistically fulfilling endeavor, and that's its sole purpose, and I kind of like it that way. And there are a lot of professional musicians I've heard talk about this, like even Misha Mansour from Periphery has said this many times recently, that he no longer tries to make any money from Periphery. Although it's the kind of band that could be very commercially successful, he's deliberately avoided that. And because of that, Periphery no longer has this kind of business stress, and it can just be a creative outlet for him, and he can really indulge what he wants to do creatively. And I
Hmm.
thought that was a really cool and interesting thing, and also cool to see such a successful artist saying that, because we probably tend to assume that a band like that, maybe they're making, decent money from that, and they could. But
Hmm.
it's really cool that they've actively chosen not to, I think.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow, this is fascinating, this interview. I really appreciate talking with you. What haven't we covered that maybe you'd like to just speak out about?
We could talk about the choice of guests, perhaps,
Okay,
because that's
sure.
something that I feel very, very proud of as well. You mentioned earlier the singer of Haken, Ross Jennings. He's a good friend of mine, and I think a really special singer. And obviously, all of us in the band, we have loved Haken for many years. But I also worked with Ross on his solo album. I played keyboards on that, which was the start of our working relationship together. And I think the cool thing with Ross is that he's a progressive singer who's very well versed in progressive music, but there's also so much more to him in terms of the music that he loves, and he's very vocal about his love of whether it's pop music or Bruce Springsteen or even folk country music, which we both love as well. So there's a very strong artistic kinship there that I wanted to write a song with him in mind where we were able to explore different territory and not just make a progressive song, but by the end of the song it's a synth pop song as well. So just take him along on this journey and see what happens, which is really cool. Then we also have my friend John Pyers, who's the other vocalist, and I was in a symphonic metal band with him many years ago called Threads of Fate. And to me, he's one of these undiscovered voices, and I'm just waiting for him to be discovered, because I think once he is, he's gonna blow a lot of people's heads off with the power of his voice, because he like me is an emotion first singer, and everything that he does musically, it starts from emotion, which is very important to me. And so him and Ross are actually playing two characters on the song. It's meant to be an internal monologue between kind of the proverbial angel and devil on your shoulder, because it's a song about mental health and having these internal conflicts. So I let him be a bit theatrical and be the devil on the shoulder and really lean into that. So it makes for an interesting listening experience. It's almost like a piece of musical theater,
Yeah.
like a sort of Broadway sort of thing, which
Yeah.
I thought was really cool. And you don't really hear that much in Prague, although
No.
you should, because
Yeah.
there's a lot of Broadway music that's really, really cool and probably has a lot of appeal to Prague fans.
And you had your sax player.
Yeah, Dorgan Munkeby, he's the frontman of Shining, the Norwegian Shining, not the Swedish Shining. I need to clarify that, because if you Google Shining band, you will either get an amazing Norwegian kind of avant-garde progressive band, or you will get a Swedish black metal band who sound very different. So
Yeah.
it's not the Swedish band, it's the Norwegian band.
Uh-huh.
But he's also played with Isan and he played with Devin Townsend. Caligula's Horse, I know he played with Periphery as well. So he's done a lot of work, and he's a really interesting sax player. He plays with a passion and a vocabulary that is not normal to me.
Yeah.
And when I had him do the solo for Catalyst and he sent it back, it took me 5 or 6 listens to really process what he had done, because he told a story that I didn't expect. And he has a sense of melodicism that's very different than maybe the typical jazz saxophone player. But he's a very special player and a great guy as well. Lastly, we have Aspera on the first 3 tracks, Jupiter. Aspera is a vocal trio who, the leader of Aspera is the singer of Exploring Birdsong, which is a English band that some of your viewers may know, kind of progressive alt-rock band. Another band that has no guitar, actually.
I'll have to
Piano,
look
bass, and
them up.
drums.
Yeah.
Beautiful music. Really lovely songwriting. A lot of compositional intricacy, but not necessarily in a super technical way. More in a thoughtful way, which I love. But she has a very special voice, and all 3 of them in the trio are just incredible singers. They tour with the band Sleep Token, and they've been performing live with Sleep Token for many years at this point. But I had them contribute wordless vocals because there are no lyrics on that song, but I wrote that song many years ago anticipating vocals, and so I missed having some element of the human voice on there. And I had them contribute wordless vocals, some of which I wrote and some of which they arranged. And it's everything from big kind of gospel choir textures to a moment on the song that's almost a Great Gig in the Sky sort of thing, where, you know, one of them really starts wailing in that beautifully evocative way. So it's, you know, I love the human voice, even though we're an instrumental band. I really, really love and respect singers. I think part of it may be that I'm not a great singer, so I have a lot of envy for those who can do it in such a beautiful way. So I love working with singers, and I love bringing them into Lux Terminus in ways that are, you know, maybe a bit interesting or unexpected.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Vikram, I really appreciate your time, and everybody check out Lux Terminus' new album coming out, Cinder it's called, and you gave us a good insight into what was involved in making it, the time, the investment in your time, and the guests you had, and also the metaphysical aspect of the songwriting. That's really interesting to me. I want to focus more on that with a lot of people I talked with, so I'm glad you were out coming with that.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So everybody, check all the info down below, and we're signing off. Thanks for being part of this podcast, and hopefully we'll talk again soon sometime.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. It was a real pleasure to get to know you and talk with you. So
All right.
let's do it
Cool.
again sometime.
Me too. For sure. Okay. All right. Cheers.
Take care, man.
Bye.
Bye-bye. North Carolina, Asheville specifically.
Oh, okay. Were you affected by the huge flooding?
Yeah, actually, I was on tour in Europe at the time. I was gone like the exact time when things were really, really, really bad.
Yeah.
I was at B-Prog, my friend, actually. And so I really had no idea how bad things were until I came back, and it was like this area in particular got hit very hard. But thankfully, you know, our place was safe. My fiance is safe. You know, all our gear, all the toys were unaffected. So,
Oh
could have been
wow,
a lot
that's
worse.
yeah, it could have been worse. Yeah, I know how terrible. We watched it a lot, mostly on YouTube. My wife and I were keeping track of that. Well, that's kind of a blessing then that you were on tour at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, in a sense. I mean, I felt a little bit disconnected from everything, which was a bit strange, to be honest. I mean, because I didn't really have a comprehension of how bad things were. I just thought, okay, there was a lot of rain,
Yeah. Yeah.
and this area is no stranger to a lot of rain, and it's not the first time it's flooded either.
Right.
But just a 15-minute drive north from me was the really famous shot of like everything that went all over social media where you had the signs obscured by like many meters of water.
Right.
Was just 10-15 minutes from me, which
Yeah.
was really
Crazy.
bizarre to see.
Crazy.
Yeah,
So,
Mother Nature.
yeah. Well, I bet you that's going to impact your songwriting in the future. You're probably going to want to write a song about that, eh? If you haven't already.
Yeah, most likely, among the
Mm,
many things that make life in 2025 complicated, climate
yeah.
change and
Yeah.
things like
Yeah.
these are very much a part of the story.